Welcome to our podcast, Doctor Diaries, Adventures to Ireland. I'm your host, Graham. The aim of this podcast is to showcase doctors' relocation journeys to Ireland. So whether you're a doctor interested in the move or just curious about life in Ireland, this is the podcast for you. Now, let's get into today's episode. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Doctor Diaries, Adventures to Ireland. Today our guest is Wilma Fouche. Wilma, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Tell us a little about you and your journey.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks for inviting me. So, as you said, my name is Wilma. My maiden surname is actually Fouche, but I'm Fouche at the moment. I am currently an emergency medicine registrar in University Hospital Galway. I am in my third year of my BST in emergency medicine training and on my way to go and drop off my HST application later this afternoon. So
amazing.
For the next 4 years.
Caught you in the moment of moving upwards in the training program. Great.
Well, hopefully. There's still lots of water under the bridge before that happens, but fingers crossed.
Sure. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, or holding thumbs for you, Wilma, for channeling our Sapphirs. So let's go back to the very beginning if we can. Remind us, when did you get here? It was the middle of COVID, right? So that was what, end of 2020?
Just before COVID started, actually. I arrived in early February. It was still fairly easy, and then within sort of a month of me arriving, everything became a lot more difficult.
Yes, sorry, so February 2020, wasn't it? Yes, yeah.
Yeah. It's almost 5 years now.
And surely at this point you must have your Irish passport or it's on the way.
Not yet. You can only actually apply after about 5 years, so we'll leave that until next year. There's a few other bits that need to be done before the end of this year first, so I'm not quite thinking of it yet.
Well, you're not too far off it, which is great. No. And it's I've been told anyway, a lovely passport to have because it just makes things so much easier when it comes to travel, when it comes to travel across Europe and the rest of the world. So that's something to look forward to next year.
Yeah.
Talk us through the first job we jumped into. We started off in Kerry. What were your first impressions of Kerry?
So I suppose we decided to make the move around August 2019. And I think I actually spoke to Connor initially.
Yes.
When we tried to get a job for me, because we ended up looking for my husband first, and he chose he got a job in Specsavers in Killarney. So the next step was going onto Google Maps and looking where's the closest hospital. And I could still remember Connor's surprise when I said I want to go to University Hospital Kerry. The initial plan was emergency medicine, but at that point they didn't have any jobs available. It was either general medicine or pediatrics. I said, okay, well, we'll interview for peds, see what we get. And I ended up getting the peds job initially. So I started out in peds, started about a month late, just because my paperwork was only finalised towards the end of December. I think it was just after Christmas that I got my work permit. And then I had to give my month's notice in South Africa. So I ended up moving in early February. So I think I arrived the 4th of February. And did my 6 months in pediatrics, and then I moved over to emergency medicine as a registrar. Really
the wonderful team of Hurlo and Martin and all the gang there who no doubt looked after you very well.
Yeah, no, they did. I don't regret a single moment of the 2.5 years we spent in Kerry. But always be a special place, and if it wasn't for them, I would definitely not be where I am today. So,
absolutely.
No
it's always good to remind yourself of those people who've helped you along the journey too. Yeah. So then talk us through then jumping on to the basic specialist training program from your time there in Kerry.
So I was fairly fortunate in that because of difficulties with my husband's degree, the consultants in Kerry were kind enough to offer me a critical skills permit, which made getting my stamp 4 at that point. The stamp 1H hadn't existed yet, so it was still general work permits. So they were kind enough to change my permit over to a critical skills one. That made sort of it a little bit easier. I hadn't quite gotten my stamp 4 by the time I had applied for my BST, but by the time I'd started my first BST job, I was on my stamp 4, which makes a big difference. Unfortunately, it still does.
Sure.
So I had a good lot of encouragement from the consultants down in Kerry to start getting my exams done. So I started my first year here. I started my membership exam, my first the primary, and by my second year I had my SBAs done. And then I sort of procrastinated a little bit with the OSCE, so that's due in December
Okay.
now. They encouraged me to do audits and projects and small QIPs. There was sort of a management side of things. They encouraged me to do the rota, to sort of stick to the NCHD committee. So there was a lot that they guided me with, because I was still very, very uncertain initially, because the specialist programs here look entirely different to what we're used to back home. And I'd spent just 2 years as a registrar in ED. The application's fairly straightforward, but it is a little bit easier if you have a foreign degree to have, I suppose, to make yourself more appealing for the application.
How
It
do you
just
mean
makes it
by
a little
that?
bit easier, just in terms of having bits done and so on. Because if you remember, your competition is essentially with, let's say, either Irish trained doctors that have just finished their internships, or Irish trained doctors who have either done a year or two as a standalone in Ireland itself. Sometimes they go over to the UK or to Australia or New Zealand. So it is a bit more tricky. You're still fairly sort of bottom of the list if you don't have your Irish passport yet. Even with your stamp 4, you're still at the bottom of the list. So it is tricky.
Sure.
It doesn't always happen the first time. From other colleagues and so on, I was exceptionally fortunate to get it on the first go. I was reserved initially, and then someone pulled out, and I managed to get a spot.
Key thing
And
to remind ourselves
yeah,
here, though, Wilma, is you did a lot of the right things there to get that spot. It wasn't luck. It
yeah.
wasn't, yeah, it might have been chance that someone pulled out, but you ticked all the right boxes. So going back, you'd referenced, you didn't use this wording, but in around, finding like a champion or an ambassador to support you to do, get in, engaged with the rota, to do various different audits and courses. How did you go about finding that sort of champion or cheerleader to assist you with preparing to get on to the BST?
I suppose it was just showing an interest and showing that you'd be willing to go for it, because ultimately it is a bit tricky to wrap your mind around the idea that you're starting over. As your
Sure.
colleagues that you graduated with in South Africa is getting to a point where they're actually finishing with their specialist degrees, you're starting from square one, and it's not just a 4-year training scheme or a 5-year training scheme, as your sort of schemes are typically in South Africa. You're looking at a 7 to 8 year process if you're lucky,
Sure. Yeah.
which can be a little bit tricky. And there wasn't a specific champion. It was really a combination of all three of the consultants down in Kerry that really, they each guided me in a different way, and they each helped me with different parts of that application and sort of, I suppose, sprucing up my CV to prepare for that application, which makes a big difference.
Absolutely. And equally,
Yeah.
having those names on your CV too as references has to help
Yeah.
to some degree.
Yeah.
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 That's amazing. And you make a very good point. It's just, eager to show that interest. And we're within Match Medics, when we're preparing people for even their first interview here, we make it very clear to them, take this opportunity to say, these are my interests. I'm keen to get onto the training program. How can you help me, support me to get in that direction? And some people will know it depends on the hospital, it depends on the team that you manage to land with as your first job. But again, I think in this respect, to a degree, you got a bit lucky having those supportive consultants around you, but then also down to you and your initiative to say, hey, I'm really interested to get onto the training program. Help me. What can I do? And it's clearly helped. So now moving closer to present day, in Galway, what's life in Galway like compared to country living in Kerry?
Well, I suppose the weather's just as bad, seeing as we're still in the west of
Okay.
Ireland.
Yeah, yeah.
It's great. The hospital's a lot bigger. The team is a lot bigger, where I think in Kerry we would usually, I think, about 6 to 8 registrars. It's about double the number. And at the
Okay.
moment in Galway, where we had in Kerry, I think we were about 6 to 8 SHOs as well. We're sitting with a team of about 20 SHOs.
Okay,
So
so the team is huge.
the
Yeah.
hospital system is a lot bigger. If you're looking at your sort of daily ED attendances, Kerry was usually about 170 in a 24-hour period, where I suppose a couple of weeks ago, Galway maxed out at 320 for the day.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it's a lot
That's
bigger, it's a
big.
lot busier.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's lovely. The other thing is the only thing that sort of tends to be a bit more difficult in Galway is rent is a lot more expensive, and traffic and everything is a little bit worse, especially during the tourist seasons. It's almost nice. It's nice during the winter when there's not much tourists around.
Says the South African in Galway.
I know, it's
Very good.
horrible, isn't it?
And tell me, talking about the patients then, if we're to bring you back to, say, how do patients either in Kerry or in Galway compare to what you're used to from when you qualified in South Africa?
Well, I suppose my last year, so we moved just after so I did 1 year post community service and then we moved over. And that year was spent in between private emergency departments as well as a trauma unit in Bloemfontein and Pelanaomi. So your patient cohort, I suppose, especially in the state sector, was young, drunk, either involved in assaults or motor vehicle accidents. So I suppose your patient demographic and purely just trauma is a lot more different, I suppose, a lot different compared to here, where you're dealing with a population that's the majority of the population that you're seeing in the emergency department is sort of, I'd say, 65 and older. And it's a lot more medical based rather than trauma based. And even the traumas that you do tend to see here is a lot different as compared to what we're used to. And the management of it is also a little bit more, because we don't have our dedicated trauma centres here yet, it can be a little bit tricky to navigate the Irish trauma setup. Yeah, but it's a little bit, and a lot of your presentations also a little bit, I suppose, lower acuity than what we'd be used to seeing in South Africa, where the lower acuity things we might actually redirect to the primary care clinics in the morning. It's because you don't have the resources to deal with that in a busy emergency department overnight. So it looks different. Like, I've learned a lot here in terms of navigating the medical side of things, but in one sense, from a trauma point of view, your exposure is a lot less.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's good. And again, a lot of South Africans we help support come across talk about that initial work culture shock, and that is, they need to stop themselves and say, "I'm not firefighting here." And there are resources here around me. There are other specialties here around me. I'm not in emergency and anesthetics and surgery and OBS all at once. I am in my lane. How did you find that, going back to your first time in Kerry, adjusting to that shock?
Well, I suppose with the initial shock was in a junior peds job, where your threshold for admission was fairly low. So in general, pediatrics in South Africa tends to be fairly tragic in terms of the types of presentations that you see with severe acute malnutrition, whether it's infectious diseases, and pediatric mortality is also a lot more common in South Africa as compared to here, where it was difficult to make that mind shift of not everyone here is as sick as what we're used to seeing back home, which can be a little bit tricky, and I do think that the approaches to managing certain things is a little bit like, your resources are much better here, so you have access to a lot more. So minor things you're able to manage according to certain protocols and procedures, where I think a lot of the time in South Africa you end up improvising, just depending on what you have in the cupboards or what you have access to at that moment in time, which is not always appropriate in Ireland.
Going then, exactly, yeah, and then going to both university teaching settings where you're working, going there, what was your, I guess, initial reaction to, our sort of perception of a well-resourced environment that perhaps might get a bit of slack from others who may not have had the experience that you've had?
I think the biggest surprise that I had was when I arrived in the emergency department the first time and they were using disposable suture kits.
Okay. Right, okay.
And apparently that's the most frequent reaction they get from all the South African doctors, is the pure shock when you realise that you're putting 4 stitches in and you're dumping the whole kit in the bin. Whereas in South Africa, it's a fight to try and get a suture kit that, firstly, find a suture kit, and then secondly, find a suture kit that actually has instruments in that, and all the instruments are working properly.
Wow.
So I'd say that was sort of the biggest. I know
Yeah.
it seems small, sort of thinking back on it now, but it's the one sort of part that did stick a little bit.
But it's a big deal though. You know, you train as a doctor and you then qualify, you do your internship and your community service back home, and then the expectation is that the resources are there for you to do your job. And that's a big thing then, moving to a system where we're not going to sugarcoat. The Irish system has its challenges too, and you referenced it there earlier on, you know, attendance numbers in emergency departments is high in our bigger cities, but you don't have to consider having the equipment there as a luxury, which you would have back home.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's
very, very strange
and
when you
then
think of it that way.
and then I suppose at the same time knowing your limitations. I mean, we all tend to arrive with a
Yeah,
ton of experience, but we're still junior doctors. It's not that
sure.
we might have volume, but we don't have the years of experience. And you get used to the concept of actually knowing those limitations and sticking to those limitations because it's safe to do so. Whereas in
Exactly.
South
Yeah,
Africa, you
yeah,
might just not have had a choice to stick to those limitations. You might have been the best option that that patient had at that point in time. Whereas here, there is very often, and most of the time, there is a better option if you're not experienced enough. But knowing
yeah.
that and knowing when to
Dare I
step back
say,
is important.
survival medicine versus management are the two different worlds that you've come to experience.
Yeah, yeah, and it takes a bit of time to get used to that and to know when it's better for you just to take a step back and let someone else do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. That's great. Thanks for taking us through that whole work journey. Outside of work, then tell me, you know, when you came here first, again, just at the beginning of COVID, you know, people weren't socializing, and you come to a brand new country. Aside from work, you want to meet new people, you want to get to know the culture. What did you guys do at that stage when you may as well have been at home because you were isolating from everything outside of work?
Well, at that point, so I was in Ireland alone up until mid-October that year. Because that
Gosh,
was when we could get my husband over, and then the dogs came
yeah,
across sort of towards, I think it was the end of November, if I remember correctly. Luckily, in those first couple of weeks, there was another SHO that had started in Peds when I started, that's from Chicago, and we ended up becoming fast friends, to be honest, and we were sort of each other's
yeah.
bubble for that entire 10-month period up until that first lockdown ended.
Okay,
I'd say
yeah,
which made a huge difference. But no, it was tricky. I mean, we loaded. I think the furniture was loaded in South Africa in May that year. Furniture arrived in September, and my poor husband was left at the house in Bloemfontein trying to sell the house during the COVID pandemic. With
okay,
3 dogs in the house, he had a bed. The washing machine had come with, so he was washing his clothes in the tub. And
wow,
about
okay,
5 days after the furniture was loaded, the fridge broke.
okay,
He had a tiny bar fridge for the period of May to September when he moved
wow,
in towards my parents' house before he made the move across.
okay. So living kind
So
of
yeah, it
like a
was
college student again with the dogs.
pretty much, yes.
Yeah,
But it was nice having the furniture here when it arrived.
I'm sure. I'm sure. So maybe better way of phrasing that then. Once we had COVID somewhat behind us, and
Mm.
your husband was here, and all the furniture and all the dogs, and your life, as it looked like, were firmly here, and we're all somewhat able to go back to normal. Did you have that initial, I want to find other Safas here, or what did you do when we were all able to socialize again? What did you do to find your tribe here in Ireland outside of work?
So we tend to be homebodies. So we like the house and we like spending the evenings together, and we might have a few close friends, but it's not a huge group of friends. And we had a few people that we sort of ended up clicking with in Tralee, but I think we really only started finding, or well, I did, especially work-wise, and a lot of work friends and so on, that ended up just becoming personal friends in Galway. I think it took us a bit of time to settle. Like we were always happy we made the move, but I think the first 2.5 years were still fairly difficult. Like you still
Can
feel the
imagine.
after effects of COVID a little bit, and especially sort of moving into a smaller town, the community tends to be one that grew up together. So it is
Okay.
difficult to find your way. So you end up making friends with, I suppose, our other foreigners. So we try and not limit ourselves to just making friends with South Africans.
Okay.
I find if you're making friends with just South Africans, then you're not really experiencing, you might as well just still be in South Africa, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
try and branch out a little bit, but in general, if you give me the option between going out for drinks at night or having a quiet evening at home, we both tend to prefer the quiet evening at home.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I can certainly relate to that, Wilma. So I totally get it. Amazing. Well, look, let's, if it's okay with you, jump into a few quick fire round questions to see how much you've ingrained yourself into Irish culture. The first one being, where's your favourite place to visit in Ireland?
So there was a lovely hiking trail in Kerry that one of the nurses told us about. That's not openly advertised everywhere.
Are you willing to share the secret?
So I don't know. I
Or
don't know
is it
how
under lock and key?
if the pronunciation is right, but it's called Glenaginty. So it's a sort of a 4 and a 7 kilometer loop that looks out on Tralee, but just sort of in
Wow.
between sort of woods, and then it's just absolutely lovely, especially when you catch it on a nice day with nice weather.
Yeah.
And in Galway, we're very close to Barna Woods, so we usually like
Okay.
taking the dogs there. And then you can there's a dedicated trail, but you can actually walk into the woods and explore a little bit and let them off the leashes and so on. So that's lovely. But those are sort of my two favourite places that sticks.
Amazing. And I'll have to venture out that way once our two little ones are more willing to jump out of the buggy. Next up, favourite Irish celebrity.
I think, I don't actually know why, but I still think Pierce Brosnan. He still remains my
Okay.
favourite James Bond. Yeah, I might
Yeah.
get some flack for that because it might be controversial, but that's the one
You
that I
might
like.
well, yeah, not amongst the Irish anyway. We'll always take that one, but the Daniel Craig fans out there mightn't be too pleased with that, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, good choice. You've been here for quite a while. No doubt you've come accustomed to the Irish slang and the few odd unusual phrases. Maybe you even use some of them on a daily basis now. What's your favourite?
Fair play.
Fair play. Okay.
Yes.
And do you find yourself using that?
More to be fair. I use that one
Okay.
more.
Okay.
That, and then the amount of times people seem to say goodbye when they put the phone down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely from our neck of the woods. Yeah, it might tend to be saying goodbye longer than the call is actually. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Are you finding now you're calling back to South Africa? Are you finding yourself doing that too? The long
Um,
goodbye?
well, most of the time, I mean, for us, we tend to switch over to Afrikaans as soon as we're at home. So most of our phones back home are still Afrikaans as well. Speaking it's still
Okay.
okay. Texting it is becoming a little bit. Yeah, my mom's not terribly impressed with my grammar, but anyway. But no, those habits haven't quite swung over into phone calls back home. But I have started noticing that
Okay.
when you do sort of speak to someone over the phone at work or speaking to some of the Irish friends and so on, you do tend to do that just a little bit.
It means you're part of us. Last one, in terms of home comforts, and there's plenty of South African shops here now where you can get some of the goods, but no doubt you've a long wish list for family to bring over the next time they're visiting. What's on your home comfort wish list?
Well, usually, depending on the time of the year that we get visitors over, it'll be Beacon marshmallow Easter eggs.
Yes, I heard all about them. They're incredibly hard to get. So yeah, if you've any spare, send them our way, Wilma.
Unfortunately, they usually don't last very long in the house.
It's okay.
And then knickknacks and
Yeah,
usually
I've
spices.
had the pleasure of having knickknacks. Tell me, what's your favorite knickknack flavor?
The original, the cheese one.
The cheese. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We tried some ourselves a short while back, and chutney was my preferred flavor. Again, possibly a controversial choice, but I'm happy to fend off any criticism for that. But yeah, knickknacks, something I think Ireland needs to get into our crisp selection, because they're really a treat to behold.
Yeah, they do have some ones, I think, in Aldi, and some of the I think some of the Duns and Tesco's sell them, but they're just not quite the same as knickknacks. I don't know if I'm just
Yeah.
imagining things. Yeah.
No, I'm happy to agree with you on that. Knickknacks, can't beat them. Definitely can't beat them. Very good. And, again, such a great insight you've given us from particularly the time that you came across alone too, as a solo mover and waiting for the rest of the family to join you. It's a challenging time moving jobs and moving country, but then to do it alone initially can't have been easy. So thanks for being so honest and open with that, Wilma. One last piece, and that is if you were to give any bit of advice to anyone listening to this who's considering a move across, what would you say to them?
Just that it's not, I suppose, that cliched saying of the grass isn't always greener. You have to choose which things you enjoy here and which things you're willing to sacrifice making the move this side. The move isn't for everyone. There's lots of people that have gone back and that really don't regret the decision to go back. Realizing that decision and the move is what you make of it. You can choose to be very happy here and sort of, I suppose, accept the sacrifices that you make in terms of leaving your culture behind to a certain extent, leaving your family behind in most cases, and making a new path for yourself this side. My philosophy with this is always, you don't necessarily immigrate for the first generation. It's usually a thing where you think, when you have kids, do you want them to grow up in South Africa with the challenges that we face there at the moment? Or is there a possibility that you might make a different path open for them and make it easier for them in the future? It's a tricky decision to move. It's not easy, and you don't always get the support that you want from all the people involved around the move as well. And if you do come in and give it your everything, if you come with one foot already outside the door, I do think it's a little bit more difficult to make the adjustment here. But it's by no means perfect. But we haven't regretted a single day of the decision. And it was a fairly quick decision.
That's so great. Thank you so much, Wilma, for taking the time to join us on the podcast today. And I have no doubt there's someone out there that will take something from this. So thanks again for joining us, and best of luck on your continued specialist training journey from here.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Appreciate the time.
Talk soon.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you like what you heard today, please follow wherever you get your podcasts. Want to kickstart your relocation journey? Reach out to the team on our socials at Matchman.